We were supposed to meet in a few weeks in Rome, but you know what's happening, and we're not. So with Barbara, we decided, why not we use technology to broadcast some of our talks and also have the chance to network. We can't see physically, we can't sit down and have a glass of wine or a beer, but we at least can talk. So, you know, we got an enormous amount of webinars, some the Digital Rome, Tallinn, and now I see the program is everywhere. There is a Zoom meeting basically every hour. So we basically spend our life in Zoom right now. We don't work anymore. But tomorrow is the Labor Day, and I'm sure our guests are going to celebrate that. I'm just joking, of course. Don't forget that we are live on YouTube as well. We're live here. The event will be recorded, and you will be happy to share it with your social network. We have 3 amazing speakers, and we are going to cover a topic that, you know, guys, it creates some concerns. Since there is the COVID-19, and Barbara, don't look at me like that way, but since there is the COVID-19, and I wondered, how is the economy going to recover without the state? Should the state come in? And Barbara came up with this, and Barbara and the team, and I want to thank the team, of course. The topic is, shall we have a bailout? And can governments help the economy? And I know the answer there, but allow me to be concerned. For the first time in my life, I was a bit concerned. So I said, yes, I want to moderate the meeting because I need to be brainwashed again. So we have 3 speakers. We have Mark and we have Michael that are in the United States, 7 and 9 hours back, if I'm not wrong. I will read their bio, but they're also online on our website for the Free Market Roadshow. And then I have Barbara here. We all know Barbara, but I want to start with Barbara. Barbara is a never-ending worker. She is, if we think about Joseph Francis, you know, back then, Joseph would be ashamed how Barbara works hard. And I want to start with you. And I know the answer, but give some arguments, please. Can we get a bailout? And will the bailout save us? Or can we make it without a bailout?
Well, thank you, Pietro, for running the show again. Hi, Mike, and hi, Mark. Good to see you in the United States, safe and healthy. Your question is very tricky. It reminds us, or many economists, of what has happened in 2008, 2009, and the consequences thereof. And back then, we bailed out in Europe at least only a couple of countries. Or at least tried to, and it worked out, but we kicked the can down the road in one way or the other. So now we have a much bigger crisis, and I would like to come in with numbers, because then you are either shocked, Pietro, or you are relaxed, because you see how big and enormous the bailout either will be, or the shock that not only Europe but the entire world is being hit now by the COVID-19 crisis, or the consequences thereof. And the question is again, if governments have to step in or not. So this will be our final answer. But I give you the numbers now for Europe. As of now, for the member states of the European Union, 3.4 trillion of euros, which accounts to 25% of the entire EU GDP, have been put into on the street. They are there for bailouts, for help, for support. These are the measures that the emergency measures that governments and the European Union have agreed to. 3.4 trillion, 25%. Plus, or in addition to that, of course, the ECB stepped up in funding that temporarily using collaterals requirements of supervisory things. In addition to that, of course, there were several safety nets that were built up, and the amount of those safety nets also goes into the hundreds of billions. Apart from that, these are the so-called emergency measures. Each and every country has built additional safety nets and individual safety nets. This is the entire sum that we now know of that is being handed out or that is at risk in Europe. And then there are, of course, recovery measures that we need to look into more detail, whether it's EU financing capacities, whether it's a recovery fund that is to be discussed, whether it's micro and macroeconomic assessments. But after all, the entire goal is to save the single market and the 4 European freedoms. So what have we seen in the past couple of days or weeks, actually? A dramatic drop of GDP over in Europe, approximately an average 7.5%. This is what the IMF is actually also announcing. We could, in some countries, it's only 5%. In Europe, in some, it's 10%. Remember, at the times of the global global financial crisis in 2008, we had a number of minus 4.2% in average. Back then, it was only 62% of all countries that were exposed to the risks or to the so-called crisis. And now it's 90% of all countries that will experience a negative GDP per capita because of the consequences of the COVID crisis. So to answer your question, governments have stepped in. Our question as economists is the enormous amount of money that is being given not only for guarantees, but that is being also handed out necessary? And who will pay it back? By whom? When? And if government steps in and bailing out directly, for example, semi-state-owned companies, etc., will they then take the money, or once those companies run again, will they leave and give the taxpayers their money back? So those are the questions. And also, in addition to that, I think we also need to look into the point, do we have to mix monetary and fiscal policy? And this is what is happening right now. We have run out of many monetary tools in Europe in the past. There are still some fiscal tools that we can play with, but, and I will leave it with that. The numbers definitely are enormous. We have not seen these figures anywhere before.
Thank you, Barbara. You answered my question, making some other questions. So let me briefly and quickly move to the US, because the situation there is very similar, unfortunately. But President Trump, being the president of the US, and there's no 27 leaders that have to decide with different perspectives in different countries to manage. So Michael Williams is the founder and president of the ALTIUS Financial Inc., a registered investment advisor wealth management firm in Denver, Colorado. He brings over 30 years experience in financial planning and investment results. Michael has also created the Defenders of Capitalism project to train future leaders, citizens, and business professionals. So nobody better than Michael, of course, can answer this question. And my question is following what Barbara says, Michael. As free market supporter, didn't we get to a point where the barman, the restaurant owner, the shop owner, at a certain point, they need money even after a week they're closed? And this money can only come from the government. So a bailout in a way is necessary, or not?
Well, as you said in the bio, I started something called the Defenders of Capitalism project, part of our leadership program of the Rockies in Colorado here. And we take an approach about capitalism that's laissez-faire. And one of the major problems that people have is not understanding whether we have capitalism or not. But on this question of bailouts, my position is exactly the opposite of what's being done, and exactly the opposite of what was expressed in the New York Times recently. They had an op-ed on how to avoid economic destruction, and I'll just quote for it real quickly, that they ended the article saying there's no need to choose among the various kinds of aid that Congress is considering. I'll stress, no need to choose. The abrupt plunge in the nation's economic fortunes has no obvious precedence. It requires a massive response. Send checks to every American, lend money to every business, strengthen every social net. The risk of doing too much is greatly outweighed in this moment by the consequences of failing to do enough. The correct answer is right now, D, do all of the above. That's from the New York Times. This is what counts for wise economic thinking today, essentially saying we don't have to choose. No, this is exactly the wrong kind of thinking. It's the kind of thinking and policy prescription that we've that's gotten us into trouble time and time again. So my answer is bailouts don't work. In fact, they're counterproductive. Bailouts are in fact more immoral, and they always treat symptoms rather than the underlying illness, and usually, almost always, make the underlying illness worse than we would have had otherwise. If you think about this current crisis, we need guiding principles. We need to think fundamentally. What's needed now is an understanding of what makes for a healthy economy. We're desperate for production and innovation right now, and that means desperate for good problem solving. And to solve problems, you have to have the right incentives. And what we're doing with bailouts is creating the exact wrong incentives. We're distorting and ultimately destroying the price mechanism that allows for correct valuation and correct decision making. Everyone wants thriving businesses, available credit, low unemployment, stable prices, but we don't understand the system that actually creates that. And a big part of the system that creates that is the pricing mechanism and actually having people make decisions based upon real values. So when you talk about small businesses and they need money, they need resources. They certainly need better decision making, and they need resources. But all the, Barbara talked about the trillions in money creation that's gone on. That's certainly happening in the U.S. as well. We have lots of trillions of dollars in stimulus money, but does that money actually create resources? Do we have any more resources in the world to solve problems? No, we're actually distorting and destroying the resources that we have. So I think, on principle, I'm against any bailouts. They always treat the symptoms rather than causes. And we hear this screaming all the time. This time it's unique. This time is different. But as Barbara pointed out, we go back to 2008. We heard the same thing. This is a different kind of crisis. We have to do something different now, rather than actually understand the underlying principles of problem solving and wealth creation. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. Let me move, if I'm not wrong, to California, where we have Mark Skousen. Mark has a PhD and is an editor of forecasts and strategies. Is nationally known investment expert, economist, university professor, and author of more than 25 books. In July 2018, Mark was awarded the inaugural Triple Crown in economics for his work in economic theory, history, and education. Mark, do you agree with what was said? And again, I come back to my original question. The barman, the restaurant owner, and the shop owner that are a big part of our economy, who cannot work, and they desperately claim for resources. And governments are desperately trying to find these resources that obviously do not exist. At least if I look at my country, I can imagine about Barbara, probably in the US as well. Or do you see, as Michael and Barbara said, an alternative to that?
So first of all, let me just say that yesterday, I was on a webinar with Steve Forbes, Steve Moore, and Art Laffer, who are all members of the White House Committee to Start America. They were all quite upbeat and optimistic, which surprised me because Steve Moore in particular has been arguing that we're headed for a Great Depression. So Art Laffer is what we call a perma-bull and is always optimistic. He was even optimistic in 2008 as we were headed into the Great Recession. But this great suppression, as I call it, or as Gene Epstein calls it, the Great Suppression, is a top-down decision. This was not, and of course 2008 was that way too. It was government caused. And this one is government caused also. I mean, even though we have flus and the common cold and viruses almost every year, and we all recognize we have to get through it, and we have to take some measures to protect ourselves. This is an unmitigated disaster. It is government caused. Our so-called medical experts all got it wrong, who were predicting Armageddon, that this was going to be like the 1918 pandemic, and it turned out the evidence is pretty strong that this was a serious virus, but it wasn't anywhere near as lethal as we were expecting. So the fear mongering has been way overdone. It's not the fault of small business. It's not the fault of big business. It's the fault of these so-called medical experts who got it wrong and were drinking the purple Kool-Aid. So I'm very pessimistic about what the impact has been on this. Maybe we have learned our lesson not to depend on these experts, but they're still getting coverage and predicting we have to stay at home, and we can't start our businesses, and we can't have sporting events, and if we have sporting events, no fans can show up. We can't go to the beaches, we can't go swimming, we can't have conferences. This is insanity, absolute insanity. So I don't blame the small businesses. Steve Forbes uses the term rescue rather than bailout. So what does that mean? He's basically legitimizing the bailout, if you will, the low interest loans, the checks that people are getting, and that sort of thing. So I tend to be sympathetic with what Steve Forbes is saying, that rescue is legitimate since government caused this thing in the first place. The problem is that it's going to have incredible repercussions in the future. Congress is spending money out of control. The deficit in the United States is estimated to be $4.6 trillion. And see, we got into this in a bad situation. We were still suffering from the 2008 financial crisis. We did not get our house in order. So we were running $1 trillion deficits even as we entered this during a time of full employment. So that suggests to me that there's no discipline whatsoever on the Federal Reserve. There's no discipline. There's no discipline on Congress. And I had a big debate with Steve Moore and Art Laffer, who said inflation is not a problem. Deflation is the problem. Well, if the government can run huge deficits, if the Federal Reserve can expand the money supply and quantitative easing to trillions of dollars, and there's no impact on inflation, and deficits don't matter, then basically what we're saying is the government can spend money like crazy and there is no discipline, there's no end to it. And this is totally contrary to everything we've been taught in Austrian and classical economics, that there is no free lunch. And so I think inflation is coming back. It may not come back in terms of consumer price inflation, but it is going to create bubbles. You can see the stock market recovering very quickly. Now, I'm fully invested. I'm fully invested in the stock market right now, taking advantage of this injection of liquidity and this kind of optimism, irrational exuberance, if you will, about the recovery, that we're somehow going to have a V-shaped recovery. I think it's going to be more of an L-shaped recovery. And I'm very big on this. And you'll see what this is. I'm very big on gold, and I have a chart that shows that gold has held up very well In Europe, in the United States, doesn't matter what the currency is, gold is held up really well. And that represents in many ways a positive way of reacting to the craziness that is going on. I do think, I like to use the example of a sledgehammer. A sledgehammer used to crack a nut is a phrase that has been used to refer to what's going on here. So I'm relatively pessimistic, as it sounds like Barbara is also, Michael perhaps as well, Pietro, maybe you are too. I'll tell you, it was really shocking to see Steve Forbes, Steve Moore, and Art Laffer, who are regulars at our Freedom Fest conference, all being, you know, what me worry kind of attitude of this is all going to turn out well and there's not going to be any problems. I just don't buy it at all. I think the bailout or the rescue is extremely expensive. Yes, we can finance it with very low interest rates, but at some point the low interest rate era has to end. If you inflate the money supply, I mean, at what point do you start having too much money facing too few goods? Because as Michael says, and as Barbara says, if we're not producing products, but we're throwing more and more money at it, at some point the inflation has to come back and interest rates have to go up.
Yes, I fully see your point here. So you mentioned three big economies, but to mention a big entrepreneur like today, Elon Musk said, you know, hospitals in California are empty for 3/4. We should open again, go back to business. So basically, this is what you guys agree on. So you don't see, because what governments are using today is the danger of the COVID-19, the danger of the virus is there. And if we go back to production, it might be a sort of holocaust. Now, do you see this happening, or you say, no, we go back the COVID-19? Because Mark, I was pretty intrigued from what you said. It's not such a big deal. And if I look at numbers, at least I saw the one in California, it's true. Most of hospitals are empty, and the effect of the COVID-19, at least in certain states that I've been studying, there's, you know, very little impact, very little number of casualties, very different from Europe or from New York. So do you see that we are actually overreacting to this virus?
Absolutely. And I think the problem is, and it goes back to Hayek and Mises and the Austrian view, that we should be dealing with this crisis from a bottom-up point of view rather than a top-down point of view. We need to decentralize our decision-making and let individual businesses and individuals, that we all know what the problem is. And if you are an older person, if you're over 70, and I am over 70, you have to be cautious, you have to protect yourself. But young people, a recent study came out of Stanford, and Stanford was one of the first universities to close its universities and send everybody home. And as a result, at Chapman University, we did the same thing. Everybody's done the same thing. We've closed the universities. But the people who are least likely to suffer any serious fatality are young people, are students. And we should not have closed any of the universities at all, and we should have allowed sporting events and that sort of thing. So you cannot allow, that's why I use the example of the sledgehammer to crack a nut. I think we just went way overboard because, and the other thing that's really important is we've given government leaders way too much power. All in emergencies, they all have this executive order. Like today, Governor Newsom of California closed all the beaches. Why did he close all the beaches? Because last Saturday, everybody was having a great time and they all went to the beach and they weren't staying separate from each other and that sort of thing. But you know, we need to stop this craziness. And sadly, we have medical professors or experts, so-called experts at the top, that are way influencing our political leaders. And these political leaders have incredible emergency powers. Barbara, I suppose the same thing is true in Europe. In Europe, they all have these emergency powers, right? They can close down anything at any time. How did this happen? It maybe came out of wars or the 2008 financial crisis, where legislators, we have elected officials, we're supposed to have democracy, but we're denying democracy, because democracy is individual decision making. And as Elon Musk said, we are now a fascist country. We are no longer the land of the free. We are all fascists now. Sad.
Siri told me, talking about Apple, Siri told me that I was on mute, sorry. Mark, you quoted exactly what Elon Musk said earlier, and the CEO said as well. It's fascist. Now, Michael, do you agree with this vision? Do you see that, there should be more responsibility from individuals? Because I was very shocked to see that in the US, most of governors took this very strong position, and they used the excuse of the virus. And here in Italy, in Austria, I guess, in Germany as well, now that we're going into a reopening phase or phase 2, somebody says we need a phase 3, phase 2 is just a fake. The main concern by people is too many deaths, particularly in some areas, because we got some areas that got very violently hit. They say we are going back into a second lockdown with a lot of dead people. Do you see this risk in Denver? Is far from California, we're 2 hours difference, but is it different in Denver?
Well, I agree with Mark, mostly with what Mark said. It should be not a centrally planned reaction. I think we've overreacted, certainly in terms of shutting down the economy. That's his analogy of using a sledgehammer across the globe. Really, we've basically shut down production rather than saying, okay, what is the actual threat? In some ways, I think the government's underreacted. In the U.S., we haven't had adequate testing and really understanding the threat. I mean, government can only do one thing. It uses force, and we're seeing the sledgehammer use of force against the productive part of our economy. But properly used, the government has to use force when there are rights threatened. And so the question is, does this virus, does this disease create a situation where individual rights and property rights can be threatened? Well, absolutely. If you have people who are carrying a disease who are threatening to my health and my business, then that's a threat. And that's what the government should stay focused on and say, okay, what is the actual threat? This is a disease that we should focus, test for, find out about in the localities where it's important. I mean, in New York, maybe you need more of a sledgehammer approach, or you need more force to say this is a bigger threat to individual rights. So I agree with Mark. It should be less centralized. I don't necessarily agree with that idea of, we use that term democracy, I think, a little loosely. We're moving more toward that mob rule where, the nation, lots of people are voting for these legislators who are saying, we want this done, you have to act, rather than saying, wait, we have the rule of law. The rule of law is there to protect rights, property rights, individual rights. And what can the government do properly within the context of using force? And so I think that's got to be our focus as people who understand the cause of wealth and prosperity and health. We have to say, what is the proper role of government? And certainly it's way overstepped its bounds here. And I agree that we're on, but this crisis is just one of many that have led us down this path toward fascism. We just quit. We stop using the principles, and we don't ever learn the correct lesson.
But Mike, you started with the New York Times, and New York Times, I don't remember if it was the Times or the Post, I think it was the Times. They made an investigation or research, and they came out by saying, yes, but the virus is affecting mostly people living in suburbs, in periphery. My question here, isn't that when we do these seminars, it's a kind of libertarian, free market, classical liberal elite. And out there is plenty of people that they might not have that consciousness of freedom and responsibility. How do we deal with that? Because then a government says, particularly in the left, well, we should take care of that people.
Yeah, that's where, again, you have to have the facts. Is someone actually threatening rights? You don't necessarily need every person in the world to understand how free markets work. You need to have the people who are leaders understanding them. And it's unfortunate, Mark's talking about how, really great champions like Steve Forbes or Steve Moore and Dr. Laffer, they should be leading the way in terms of educating people about this sledgehammer approach. They probably, in some ways, like many people, once they get a taste of the power or getting close to the power, or maybe they're just saying, okay, we have to work within the political environment, so we have to be influential here, and we can't go in there just with guns ablazing about how free markets will solve this. But in my view, they should. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Michael, I was going to say that's exactly the impression I got, because they're all members of this committee that President Trump appointed. They weren't going to criticize President Trump at all. So they were this rah, everything's going to be fine, and Trump is going to get reelected and all. And it's unfortunate, the confirmation bias that we see, that they can no longer see. This is one reason Milton Friedman refused to ever be a government official and a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. That's just craziness. But one thing I would like to say about rights, we have a First Amendment in the United States, which is the right to assembly, the right to assemble. And we're at Freedom Fest. I mean, all other libertarian and freedom organizations, including Barbara's beloved free market trade show, a road show, we're all doing this online and stuff. We're not going to do that. We are planning to meet in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest in July. Hopefully the hotels will be open by then. And, freedom of assembly, I mean, that's so important, and yet it's been denied now. Nobody's even talking about that First Amendment right, the right to get together, the right to be together on a beach without being restricted. I mean, there's no question that our freedoms are being shut down arbitrarily by government. I mean, one week you can go to the beach, the next week you can't. What kind of leadership is that? It's very scary.
Thanks, Mark. Now let me go back to Barbara. Actually, I brought to her, but that's good that I chat to everybody. Guys, there is a chat where you can post your question. There is a question and answer section as well. Please send in your questions. If you are on YouTube, you can't, so you have to join on Zoom. Barbara, here, Michael and Mark, they dream a bit. They are in the US. We have a total different history here in Europe, not just in the 27, but in a larger Europe. We don't have the First Amendment. We have constitutions, but if I think about Italy, but I could say this happened in Spain, I'm not sure in Austria, many people said because of the situation, the constitution is kind of suspended. And we also hear, and you probably read in the media, our prime minister using a language that went a bit too far toward North Korea, when he said, I allow you to. And many people got, wait, we are pushing yourself a bit too far with you allow us to. But here the virus, let's say, particularly in the areas close to Vienna, if I think about the north of Italy, some parts in France, the virus was very violent and probably a lockdown was necessary. At that point, when I read Elon Musk this morning, I said, well, that's California. Milan is very different. And most of the arguments I hear in these days are, you want to go back to a lockdown again. You want to see people tubed. I said, no, I don't want to see people tubed. But they had a point. Even in Germany, they tried to open and then they had to go back to the lockdown. How do we, bring Mark and Michael ideas and try to inject them back here in Europe?
Well, thank you. I think we have to be a little bit more pragmatic. First of all, I think to solve this economic issue the mess that we are in, and the harm has been done, to be honest. I mean, the harm has been done. Our entrepreneurs, our enterprises, our businesses suffer like hell. And consequently, both the employers and the employees are the ones who are being harmed. So the harm is done, first of all. Second, to solve this, we need radical solutions. We just don't need, you know, handouts and bailouts. And by that I want to go back to pragmatism. As Mark mentioned, rescue businesses maybe is okay, but the bailouts of certain other state-owned enterprises, organizations, etc., will be very difficult. Plus, and here we go, on the one hand, those who suffer, namely the enterprises, are the ones who are supposed to pay now and to work twice as hard to make sure that they can pay taxes again in the future, but they, like any other individual, did not cause the harm. So we have this issue that the enterprises are in a very bad situation, and we want them, or actually the politicians ask them, to pay and make it possible now to save the world again. But first we cut their throat, and that's an absolute no-no, and that's impossible. So we need radical solutions to unfree, or to set the enterprises and the force of entrepreneurial spirits and thinking and innovation free again. And I think this is the best opportunity to deregulate, first of all, to cut certain laws and old-fashioned rules that we have been fighting, and that, you know, just don't make a smooth enterprise possible. So we should really cut those. We should go and look at special economic zones and allow those, even in Europe, even in the European Union. I think this would be just a great opportunity just to foster competition and to allow this kind of innovation. And then, and this is the most important threat that we see these days in Europe, that society is falling apart into those who kind of try and work hard and try to keep up and keep the pace, and the others who have given up, lean back and wait for the government handouts as individuals and their safety and their checks, and then they wait. They might have become unemployed, which is very sad and very bad for each and every individual, but then they hang in there and wait for the next handout, and then they say, oh, I have the right to, I am entitled to. And now the entire spiral is starting up again. So we divide our societies with that. Those who go for the entitlement principle and the so-called justice, that it is just that I get this handout, and the others who also were unfortunate to suffer because of the shutdowns, and they won't get anything. And they see the bankruptcies and they see the consequences of it, and their lives destroyed. So this is the real tragedy and the real imbalance. And this is where we as pro-market people and as libertarians and as responsible individuals need to discuss, because the danger is when this society is not productive anymore. And we've seen it, it's not productive. And we can't have capitalism, which is nothing else but protecting our property rights, by the way. We can't have economic growth if we are not productive and innovative. So I think radical solutions are supposed to be addressed everywhere in the world, and whether it's, you know, triggering the forces of digitalization, whether it's new ways of communication, whether it's new ways of dealing with each other, whether it's free trade agreements and not real free trade agreements and not just managed trade, all those things need to be addressed, because I see the danger that what we have achieved within a globalized world is at stake because of what is happening, that we will just be more protectionist and just more closed shops instead of open up and compete with each other.
But Barbara, there's a bunch of questions. I also get questions on my WhatsApp. People are sending questions from everywhere. Send question on the proper form that we have. But that's how they do. They send questions through Facebook, LinkedIn. They enjoy social media. There's one from Friedrich and one I guess is from Brit. Brit somehow is already answered by what you said. The one from Friedrich here. There's 3 questions. I just pick one. He says, in your opinion, are there any cases in which bailouts are right? But I assume that's a question that has already an answer from the 3 of you. But the question I attach to this is, isn't Europe going exactly in the opposite direction, Barbara, of what you have said?
Well, obviously, we are falling into the same trap again that we have seen in 2008. I mean, we have seen the years of Hoover and Roosevelt, and we have not learned from the measures that were undertaken there. Back then, and then we have seen the dot-com bubble. We have seen 2008 and many other crises. And we always try to solve the problem with the same old measures that didn't work then. Instead of, at the very beginning, I was thinking, and maybe our American friends can tell us exactly what it was. There was a crisis in the 70s in the US and a huge thing. And Reagan just simply leaned back and said, I'm not going to do anything about it. It will be solved in one way or the other by the market. And not by us as politicians. So this is a health crisis. This is a health issue as well. But the question is, how far does it go? If a socialist prime minister in Sweden asks people to behave and to use their intelligence when interacting with each other, and asking them to respect each other, I think this is something very, very good. And they have not shut down. They have not destroyed their economy. And of course they suffered deaths, but still, I think you always have to weigh. I mean, to be honest, I don't want to be in a position of a politician now and make these decisions. But we look at the figures and we see the numbers and we see the consequences of both. And therefore, I think, again, very careful what we wish for in terms of interventions.
Thanks, Barbara. Let me briefly go to Mark and Michael. They still have a day ahead. So, guys, do you see we are going even in the US in the opposite direction? I heard you were optimistic in a way, but don't you feel we are actually going the wrong way?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic.
Mark is.
Yeah, the thing is, I think Mark made some caveats there about, and I'm not making any investment recommendations. I'm too heavily regulated to make those kinds of recommendations.
Don't do it.
But I think Mark made the point that, you have to play the hand that's dealt. And it's hard to really allocate capital when you have this kind of distortion right now. You see the stimulus and that's going to have some short-term impact. So you may be optimistic for, okay, we might have a spring back, and that's how I have to allocate capital. But in the long run, we know, all 4 of us know, and I don't know the makeup of the audience, but my assumption is people know underneath that, that you can't have wealth by creating debt. You can't have productivity by laying people off. You can't have freedom and opportunity by using force. Those are just not workable solutions. And so in the short to medium term, you can invest, but I'm not optimistic at all in terms of the current trend. Now I think there's room. I think there's this pocket, and Barbara touched on it. I think this is really important to emphasize. There's this window of opportunity we have right now to make what sounds to be radical not so radical, because in the States, you have a lot of governors who are waiving regulations and repealing things to just get things done. They have to. this is the opportunity, the window we have right now to educate leaders and fellow citizens to say, look, there's a role for government here. What is the role? Mostly to get out of the way of the productive sector. And so we really can take this as an opportunity to be optimistic. And if we capture that window, to have people understand the proper role of government.
Thanks, thanks, Michael. Mark,
Yeah.
let's conclude with you because we are over time, 2 minutes already. You are investing in gold. I would probably invest in gold, but we are a very young fellow here. Yeah, I saw you, Michael. I saw you, Michael, nodding. That's a message you're sending to us. I'll follow that nodding. Mark, give us a positive message about this. We have young folks. I see a lot of names there, very young folks. What is the message for them to take home?
Well, I'll go with the sign that's behind Barbara Kolm. It says disruptive innovation, which is Clay Christensen's term, the late great Harvard business manager, kind of a Peter Drucker type of person. And Peter Drucker would certainly fit into this, a great Austrian money manager. Innovative, disruptive innovation is what we're seeing. The FDA, for example, is getting out of the way in the United States so that Gilead and other pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies can come up with vaccines and move it very quickly through the process. So that is really very positive. We're seeing a lot of benefits. Pietro, you already mentioned Zoom and these other Skype and these other technologies are developing. Although I will tell you that teaching online is just, I'm sorry, but it just does not hold a candle to actually teaching the students in person. I can never really get used to it. My wife, Joanne, she really likes it. She's found it very valuable because a lot of people, she required them to respond in order to get a grade. So it's worked for her, but not particularly for me. But still, there's, there is innovation. The problem is we're gonna be saddled with this heavy debt and these easy money policies that are gonna create artificial boom and bust, as the Austrian theory of economics teaches us. So as long as we have some form of economic freedom, we can get through this. We can solve our problems. One of the things that, we have to all look and say, what are the lessons we have learned from 2020? This is what we're going to really focus on at Freedom Fest. And Barbara, I'm hoping you can fly to Las Vegas and be a part of our program, because we don't want to do it by Skype and Zoom. We can do it if we want, but it's not the same as having it there. And getting, is it 3 kisses or 2 kisses for the Austrians? I think it's just 2, right? Okay. Well, we may not do that anymore. But if we can open the economy back up, then we have to look at what have we learned. Well, the number one thing we need to learn is don't trust the experts. The experts saying that it was Armageddon, and of course, Italy, I understand you had a really tough time in Italy, but I'm looking at the data. Okay, so in Italy, you had 28,000 deaths, and of course, the majority of those deaths were older people, elderly people who were had problems in the first place, okay, number one. But how many people live in Italy? You have 30 million people,
60,
and you
60.
shut down the entire
60.
economy because of
30 are the
30,000
one
deaths.
working.
What's that? Is that like 0.1% of the population? I mean, I think we have to, fear mongering is what drove this. We didn't have the facts, and we felt like we had to overreact, and now we're finding out we didn't have, so the Swedish model, I'm really hoping we will look at the Swedish model and say, maybe that was the way to go. So we will learn from the past, because otherwise every influenza that comes this way, are we going to shut down the economy again? Are we going to shut down our sports programs? And I mean, that's a very scary scenario. And the second thing we need to learn is how much excessive power have we given to government? Somehow we have to pull back and say, you can't be that arbitrary. We have to put limitations on government. So those are just a couple of the lessons that we're going to talk about at Freedom Fest, and I'm sure you'll be talking more about this. But this is what we need to concentrate. What are the lessons that we can learn from this experience?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Barbara. We are really out of time over the 45 minutes of our usual seminar or webinars. Thank you so much. I was so thrilled. Three great speakers, and particularly I'm familiar with Barbara, but thank you so much, Michael and Mark, for joining us today. The recording will be live, will be available on the Free Market Roadshow website. We are going to invest in gold. I see there's people online that will invest in gold. The price of gold will go up tonight. There's the full program of the Free Market Roadshow available for the entire month of March. The Rome event will not take place, at least not till the fall. Hopefully the Las Vegas event will take place, and we will have the joy to join you. Thanks to everybody that has joined us. As you can see, my face was in the moon because in the half moon, I forgot to turn on the light on the other side. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Particularly to Martin, Britt, and Victoria for assisting us all the time. Thank you so much.